All right, welcome. We're here for our third episode of This Is What Democracy Looks Like. We're here at Trophy Brewing, which is within Jay's district. And Jay, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
I'm excited to be here this evening.
Well, I know it was kind of a rough session, so I thought maybe we'd have a beer in your district and
from a great brewery.
Yeah, from a great brewery, and just talk a little bit about what happened over the last session, what's coming up, and your perspectives as a relatively new senator in the NCGA.
Sure.
So I did want to ask you, originally, what made you want to run?
So I really decided to run for a couple of reasons. First is I have a great and deep love for the state of North Carolina, and when I asked myself as to why I have that great and deep love for North Carolina, what I discovered was it came from my parents. And so, my parents immigrated to this country a little over 50 years ago. And I think one thing that amazes me is that as new immigrants back then, they had come to this strange land and they had totally fallen in love with North Carolina. And when I thought about why it was that they loved the state, it was because of progressive leaders in the state, especially folks like Jim Hunt, that was governor for 16 years. And in many ways, Governor Hunt instilled in my parents that it didn't matter whether you're black, white, or brown. It didn't matter whether you were from government, business, or universities, but that we work best when we work together. And so I'm a product of public schools. I grew up kind of being raised that way. I was around civic and public leaders that believed that, and I felt like a lot of that was being lost in the state of North Carolina. And so that's part of the reason I ran. It's also part of the reason I've been a public servant my entire life, having served in the highest levels of all three branches of government here in the state of North Carolina.
That's awesome. I think there's going to be, whenever we do actually have elections, I think there's going to be a lot of people running. And so it might be helpful for them to know what was sort of unexpected for you, or what's been surprising, or maybe what do you wish you had known before you got in?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think, at least for me, I was around politics and around public servants and those that have run for office. So in a lot of ways, I could anticipate what was to be expected. But a couple of things I would say to be on the lookout for. One is, and I hate to say this, but the importance of raising money. I mean, if you're going to plan to run for a seat in the North Carolina legislature, whether it's in the House or the Senate, you've got to be prepared to be on the phone, Rolodex, talk to your family and friends, and then be willing to talk to strangers about raising money. It's not anything that anybody enjoys. And secondly, from my perspective, which was really kind of a new venture for me, is you've got to be willing to put the shoe leather in and go knock on doors. And so I fundamentally believe that we can only win these legislative seats if we actually engage with the voter, that those discussions and conversations are not necessarily about the candidate, but what's important to the voters. And so being a good listener is really important, because actually going door to door actually makes you a better elected official, and it puts you in touch with your district.
I think that's one of the things people really enjoy about you, and why I wanted to ask you to be on the show, is that you're so accessible. And I think it really shows when you come out and you meet with people versus having to know how to navigate the NCGA and all those things. I think it just sets a very different tone.
Thank you.
And so, I want to thank you for your service in doing that, because I think I love your emails too.
Thanks.
Jason's out an email every Wednesday usually.
There's no scheduled time, to be honest with you. We're a little behind on our next check-in.
But I love the idea of this email comes out and goes, hey, this is how I spent my week. This is what I did because you voted for me, or you didn't vote for me even, right? This is how I spent my time working for you. And I love the tone that you've set with that.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely. What else has been kind of surprising to you since the election, for example, since November? There's really been a huge outpouring of grassroots, more political activism. Has that in any way affected the way the NCGA does normal business?
Unfortunately, I'd say for the most part it doesn't. I think that's unfortunately a reflection of how gerrymandered the districts are, both in the House and the Senate. I would argue it does not reflect the will of the majority of the people here. And so while we see a lot of activism and engagement with public officials, because we have these gerrymandered districts, we've completely lost accountability between the elected official and his or her constituents.
And I think a lot of people feel that too, right? That everyone's shown up, we've been out in force, writing letters, doing all these things to try to be a little bit, make it easier to represent us, right?
That's right.
And so there's a lot of frustration with just kind of not being heard.
That's right.
Part of that is definitely the gerrymandering.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other part of it might be, and I was curious to get your thoughts, North Carolina's General Assembly tends to be one of the strongest in the country.
That's right.
And so have you seen that where, the legislative is a little bit stronger than even the executive, where we've constrained the executive and potentially now the judiciary as well? So what does that look like, do you think?
Well, look, from my perspective, I bring my personal perspective, having worked 15 years in the executive branch, both for then Attorney General Roy Cooper and then State Treasurer Janet Cowell. So I come from a background of a strong executive branch that can make decisions without always consulting with the General Assembly. But that being said, they're all co-equal branches of government, and it's important in an ideal democracy that we're all working together. In many southern states, legislatures do have a disproportionate amount of the power, and when you combine that with gerrymandered districts, then it really doesn't allow for the legislature to respond to the will of the people. And so that becomes problematic, especially when you start seeing power grabs, both with the governor's office back in December and kind of continued through this session. And as you mentioned, also now with the judicial branch, I'm very concerned about kind of the rhetoric that we hear that's kind of an assault on the independence of the judiciary,
right.
Both in shrinking the Court of Appeals, but then also with the proposed idea probably going into one of the special sessions in August and September that we're going to have judicial redistricting.
Yeah, and I want to be very clear that it's not necessarily a Republican or a Democrat type thing. It's really about one of the most American of foundational ideas is checks and balances.
That's right.
So it's not just about, we have a majority Republicans right now. It's how strong the legislature is compared to the other branches. And without that check, I think we end up in potentially some kind of dangerous situations. You mentioned coming up in special session. So you've got a couple weeks breather, but it sounds like special session is going to start beginning of August. Is that right?
August 3rd.
What do you think we should be looking out for?
I'm not quite sure. I mean, so I think there's a couple of things that we can expect. I mean, I think we know for sure Governor Cooper has 100+ bills sitting on his desk. He will obviously veto a number of those bills, and so we will have a veto override. Secondly, there's certainly a lot of rumors around another kind of voter ID bill that will look to probably suppress certain segments of the voters here in North Carolina. And then I think third and fourth will be around legislative redistricting and judicial redistricting. But one thing that I have learned as a new member of the Senate is anything is possible, and that oftentimes we will tackle issues without any notice whatsoever.
Right. So it kind of makes it hard, and I feel like that's something we should maybe highlight, is that, as a member of the Senate, you don't even know what's going to be on the docket for August.
We don't. I mean, we have a resolution that's vaguely worded. But from my perspective, one of my criticisms of the General Assembly, and to be fair, it's a criticism I think that could have been applied by Republicans and Democrats when Democrats were in control, is in some ways a lack of transparency about how bills are written, the input that they get from committee hearings, and from my perspective, even just how long the General Assembly should be in session. So one of the bills that I introduced that had a number of Republican co-sponsors was having session limits, because I think it's very difficult for anyone to run for the legislature if they don't know when the General Assembly is going to start in session, when they're going to end in session. And so I had a bill that proposed a 90 to 120-day session limit, so that would give some certainty both to employers and to voters, frankly, as to when session would start and end.
And so in the way it was designed was, there's 6-week and a 6-month session originally, and the idea was so that people could go back to their jobs.
Exactly.
Then come to the NCGA and be representing their jobs, their communities, etc. For the past couple of years, it seems like special sessions have become the norm. The sessions are going longer, and I guess from your perspective, is that making it hard on some of the other work that that other senators do?
You mean as far as their other jobs that they have?
Exactly.
Yeah, of course it does. I mean, I think having a balance between your professional job and serving as a legislator becomes very challenging with the employer. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And one thing I'll say, look, I should arguably be the last member of the Senate to argue against having session limits, because as I point out to people, the longer the General Assembly is in session, they are benefiting economically the state Senate district that I live in, because they're buying more drinks at bars and they're having fancy dinners with lobbyists.
Right.
But to your point, I think that the members should spend more time with their constituents and less time with lobbyists in Raleigh.
Absolutely. I think a number of us feel that way too. So when it comes to your own voting, how do you approach a bill that comes? Let's suppose that you actually got notice on a bill and had time to read it. How do you approach, which way you're going to vote on it?
And so one thing I'll say, to be fair, in this session, at least if there's what is called a proposed committee substitute, that is a substitute for another bill, many kudos to the Rules Chair and the Senate. They will not vote on that bill. They will simply have a hearing on it, and then there'll be a vote following day. But from my perspective, you are looking for input from your constituents, so you may have heard about the issue through emails that you receive or telephone calls. There are lobbyists, both that are nonprofit lobbyists and advocates, as well as special interest lobbyists that will also lobby you on that issue. And then I've got a staff and a couple of interns, and we'll take all that information into consideration, debate and deliberate over it. I'll probably talk to other members of my caucus. I may even talk to a couple of Republicans on how they're going to vote, and then ultimately make your decision.
Okay. So how do you like to hear from your constituents? You talked about getting constituent input before deciding on a vote. What's the best way to do that? How do you prefer to receive that feedback?
I mean, I've been
over
asked
beers.
I've over beers, obviously would be the best way to do it, but there'd be a lot of beers, I guess, when you
Right.
represent constituents that live very close to the General Assembly. But from my perspective, emails are good I'd say on big issues, but also in-person meetings I find to be really important. The stories that can be told about what the impact might be on a certain bill, I think can be really meaningful. And so if there's an opportunity to do in-person meetings, I have really tried to meet with every constituent that has made a request to come meet with me, because that in-person exchange is really important.
I can attest to that.
I think we have a question.
Yes. All right, we have a question from the audience.
We do. We have a question from Ella. And she says, thanks for talking about voting rights. What can regular citizens do to help support voter access?
Okay, that's a great question. The question is, what can regular citizens do to help support voter access?
Yeah, so that question can really be answered in two ways. One is to make sure that we protect the voting rights we have already. And as I mentioned, there may be additional efforts to suppress voter rights, which may include insistence on different types of forms of identification. Mm-hmm. So we have to be able to push back on it. But there are a lot of ways to expand voter access, which are automatic voter registration. Yes. That we have, for example. I was very interested. I did not introduce a bill in this area. I would love to see better integration between the local boards of elections with individuals after they go through a citizenship ceremony, so that you were able to bring more new immigrants
right.
that become American citizens, as far as then having access and registering to vote. Mm-hmm. So I think those would be a couple of suggestions. Unfortunately, with the way the state is right now, we're more on the defense than we are right. on expanding voter access and registration.
Yeah, I think so too. And I actually just saw the State Board of Elections put forward some proposed changes.
Yes.
I was annotating those with legal counsel this weekend just for fun, and it gave really broad powers to the director of that board. Pretty ill-defined, pretty open. One of them that they specifically mentioned was potentially requiring voter ID. Mm-hmm. One of the concerns from a lot of people I've talked to is, if the Supreme Court says no voter ID, is potentially a way around that is to have it go through the State Board of Elections.
that may very well take place. I'm not enough of an expert to know how that plays out, but look, to your point, we are also seeing the interaction between the federal government and state board of elections on the database and the desire to collect voter information from the Trump administration. And there's been pushback by both Republicans and Democrats on that based on privacy issues as well.
And so we heard that the publicly available information is what was going to go to the commission.
That's right.
What was the tone like in the NCGA, among other senators or the House? What were people saying on both sides?
I mean, I wasn't privy to a lot of the conversation because it just wasn't one of the bills that we were actively voting on towards the end. So I suspect that, I don't know. I think that'd be an interesting question to pose to both Democrats and Republicans, given that there has been pushback by members of both parties in what's been requested.
Yeah, that's always interesting to me where, and that's something we try to do with this show too. It's, if we're on different sides of the aisle, and we disagree on 9 out of 10 things, doesn't mean we can't work together on that one. And so any of those areas are always of interest.
Well, and another idea, for example, I think looking at short session is looking at cybersecurity and protecting our voter rolls. I mean, we know that the state, I think based on a recent review of cybersecurity protections, is quite weak compared to other states. And so what can we do, both as Democrats and Republicans, to protect voter information here? Yeah,
and that's obviously just come up at the G20 on the federal level. So you anticipate that being part of the special session, or possibly?
I don't know if I would anticipate it being that part of special session, but I think it's an example, to your point, of an area where Democrats and Republicans can work together.
Okay, sounds great. What else are you looking forward to, either in special session or next year? What's kind of on the docket for you that's most important to you?
Well, I'd say a couple of areas. My one bill that I was able to get passed looked at expanding computer science education with students here in North Carolina. So we have 18,000 unfilled coding jobs, as you probably know, and you're probably a beneficiary of being highly in demand. But it would be great to get those coding jobs filled by having a state strategy, and also by making sure that we train our teachers to be able to teach code. Those jobs pay on average $78,000 a year, which is much higher than the median average even in Wake County for what is earned. I am also very interested on focusing on expanding community college education to other parts of the state. One of the other bills that I introduced that did not get a hearing is to look at what the top 5 or 10 growth areas in each of the regions of the state are as far as job growth, and making sure that we have educational institutions that are providing the skills and training to match.
So that pipeline is there.
Exactly. Exactly.
So kind of that connection between education and the economy.
That's right. And that becomes really important. It's a timely question because Michael Walden, the professor at NC State, came out with a paper recently that talked about the hollowing of the middle class. Here in North Carolina, we are losing the middle class, unlike, it's a trend nationally, but in North Carolina over the last 15 years, the middle class is shrinking. And even by other studies, we have one of the fastest dying middle classes in the country. And so focusing on that intersection of education and economic development is a way to make sure we reskill our citizens here in the state to get better paying jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you do that because I think it's another area where both parties can work together. I mean, it's obviously in everybody's best interest. We're all for education. We're all for employment. Keeps our state running. So I think those are great. Is there anything else that you would like to see for next year? Anything you're looking forward to?
Well, I am crossing my fingers that we will have new districts.
We all are.
So that it will provide certainty for those citizens that want to run for office. So I think at the heart of our democracy right now, not having fair districts is really undercutting our ability to work together. And I'm not suggesting that having an independent redistricting commission or having fair districts is going to solve our partisanship problem, but it certainly moves us closer, I think, in trying to work together.
Yeah, it levels the playing field a little bit. It's very important. And we talked last month with Jeff Jackson about gerrymandering, and I think a lot of people are saying the biggest thing we have to do is be able to break that supermajority. And is that where your party is also looking to.
That's right. I mean, there's a big focus on breaking the supermajority. I think even before the new maps come out, I think there's a sense that there's a lot of momentum on our side. There are certainly a lot more people that are interested in running for office. I suspect, Virginia is kind of a good harbinger of what's going to happen in North Carolina. In Virginia, they have candidates, I think, for almost every House and Senate seat that's being contested, and I fully expect we'll see the same thing here in North Carolina.
Yeah, that's great. I hope we do. We certainly want to see more competitive districts.
Absolutely.
So, do we have another question, or do we take a live one?
We have an earlier question about, are there any parts of bipartisanship left, and what can we build on from there?
Oh, that's a great question. What can we build on in a bipartisan fashion? What is left? What is left that we could do that with?
Well, look, I made an effort when I first started the Senate to meet with every Republican member of the Senate. The nice thing about being in the Senate is it's a smaller group of us. There are only 50. And I think the consensus was we're not going to agree on the big issues around education, around tax policy, probably even around civil rights, but we can agree on smaller issues. And so there are examples of bipartisanship. One that probably a lot of viewers celebrated this past Sunday is the Sunday brunch bill, the free mimosa bill. But even at Trophy, I think there was a line at 10 a.m. to be able to have alcohol, so there was great bipartisanship around that.
We come together for alcohol in North Carolina.
We did. Cheers to that. We obviously had a bipartisan bill that looked at opioids, looking at the opioids issue. That brought together Attorney General Stein and a number of Republicans there that looked at both treatment issues as well as controlling the dispensing of prescription drugs. We had bipartisanship around kind of revitalizing the Teaching Fellows program.
Right.
That was a fantastic program under Governor Hunt. Senator Chad Barefoot and Lieutenant Governor Forrest kind of resurrected that to focus on STEM teachers. But so there are a number of examples. Raise the Age was another one. That was a big bill that got passed and was signed into law now that no longer has 16 or 17-year-olds tried as an adult for misdemeanors
that
they are nonviolent crimes they may have committed.
Right. That's fantastic. Was there?
We also have another question.
Okay, we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap up.
So who in the NCGA is championing healthcare?
Right, so this is a huge one, and we know this is really going on at the federal level. And most of our viewers have been very active, contacting Senators Burr and Tillis. And the NCGA, here in North Carolina, who would you say has been really a champion for healthcare? How has it come up at the state level?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So look, I mean, the governor is probably the greatest bully pulpit we have as Democrats to champion that issue both at the federal level and the state level. And in the state Senate, I'm not going to hold myself out as being a champion for it, but we did almost all members of the state Senate signed a letter that was sent to the conference committee when the Senate and the House were conferencing to say that they should make sure that they maintain certain goals of the Affordable Care Act that included keeping pre-existing conditions in place, making sure that you had a lot of the services that were provided for maternity leave, for paternity leave, for prenatal care, and so forth. So there were 4 or 5 conditions that were set out, and we never heard back from them. I would say certainly on the House side, Representative Gail Adcock, who was a nurse, who was the chief, I think the chief medical officer for SAS, as someone who's very moderate in the middle, and I think she's looked is viewed as an expert in that issue, and as someone that actually commands a lot of respect from both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, that's great, and that's one of the best things about the idea of shorter sessions is having those people who are experts in different areas, because when the bills come up, you already have subject matter experts within your ranks, and I think that carries a lot of weight. I mean,
one other healthcare issue that I will share with you, which will never have my name on it, and I don't necessarily want to take credit for it, because part of I see my role is to if you give a good idea to someone, as long as it gets passed, that's all that matters. But I will say that Representative Greg Murphy, who is the only physician in the House, I approached him early in the session and said, what do you think about having an Alzheimer's disease registry, one that can be used not only for research purposes, but also to kind of track folks that need potential treatment going down the line. And to his credit, there's more than $500,000 in the new budget that has that establishes an Alzheimer's registry. And so that's kind of a great win for the state.
Yeah, and a potential area for that public-private partnership.
Exactly.
It's something that Senator Tillis would be willing to get involved in.
That's right.
Potentially too. So
that's right. And in a region like here, we have a lot of life science companies who have a real vested interest in research around Alzheimer's.
All right. Well, I just want to ask you one last question, then we'll wrap it up.
All right.
Because it's been really good talking to you. I could probably talk to you all evening. What are you most proud of from this last session?
Wow, that's a really good question. So, I'd say I'm most proud of probably kind of fulfilling or at least staying true to why I ran for the state senate, which is to really stand up for progressive values that are important to constituents in my district. And so, whether it's fighting to keep Jordan Lake clean by speaking out against, using freshwater mussels to clean Jordan Lake, and ultimately that idea failed as a concept, whether it's speaking out against HB2 to make sure that we speak out against those that are marginalized,
right.
Speak out against immigrants. In my state senate district, 1 out of every 5 residents in this district are immigrants. Speaking out for those that don't have a voice is really important.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I was able to last week announce and work closely with the governor and bring in 2,000 jobs with emphasis, which is not something I would ever imagine to be part of my role, but to be able to bring that to Wake County and have 2,000 high-paying jobs that also would hopefully reskill folks into the middle class is a great feeling.
Yeah, you should absolutely be proud of that one, and I know the Raleigh area is definitely going to appreciate that when those jobs come. So thank you for being an advocate, for using your voice for those who don't always, and for being here with us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys. Tune in next time.